Imagine you're using an old map to find your way, but the roads have changed. No matter how hard you try, you keep getting lost. That's what happens when we hold on to outdated beliefs. We stick to what we know even when the world around us has changed. But what if I told you that the smartest people aren't the ones who know everything, but the ones who are willing to rethink what they know? Welcome to this deep dive into Adam Grant's book Think Again: The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. In this audiobook, I'll take you through the key lessons from the book, one step at a time. This book isn't about learning more. It's about unlearning and rethinking. If you want to grow, you need to challenge your own beliefs, be open to new ideas, and change your mind when needed. In this series, we'll explore why rethinking is so important, how to do it, and how it can transform your life. So, get comfortable, open your mind, and let's begin. The power of rethinking. Think about the last time you changed your mind about something big. Maybe it was about your career, a relationship, or even a simple habit. Was it easy? Probably not. Most of us grow up believing that intelligence is about knowing things. The more you know, the smarter you are, right? But Adam Grant challenges this idea. He says true intelligence is not about knowing, it's about rethinking. Rethinking means questioning what we know, being curious, and staying open to change. But here's the problem. Our minds love certainty. Once we believe something, we defend it, even if new evidence proves us wrong. Think about scientists. The best ones don't just look for proof that they're right. They look for proof that they might be wrong. They experiment, test, and adjust their theories. Imagine if we lived life that way, treating our beliefs like hypotheses instead of fixed rules. In this first chapter, Grant teaches us that rethinking is a skill. And like any skill, we can develop it. The more we practice questioning ourselves, the better we get at growing and adapting. So how do we start? First, we need to accept that being wrong is not a weakness. It's an opportunity. Instead of feeling embarrassed when we realize we were wrong, we should feel proud, because it means we've learned something new. Second, we need to listen more than we talk. Most of us listen just to reply. But real learning happens when we listen to understand. When someone challenges our ideas, instead of arguing, we should ask, what if they're right? And third, we need to make rethinking a habit. The best way to do this? Surround yourself with people who challenge your views, not just those who agree with you. So, the big question for today: what's one belief you've never questioned? And what if it's wrong? Our minds are like locked doors. Once we believe something, we close the door, and it becomes difficult to open it again. But why does this happen? Why do we resist rethinking? One big reason is comfort. It feels good to be certain. When we believe we already know something, we don't have to put in the effort to think again. It saves time and energy. Our brains are designed to take shortcuts, and sticking to old beliefs is one of those shortcuts. Another reason is identity. Many of our beliefs are connected to who we are. If someone challenges them, it feels like they are attacking us personally. Imagine you have believed something your whole life, and suddenly, someone tells you it's wrong. It can feel scary. You might feel like everything you knew was a lie. That's why people often get defensive instead of being open to change. Think about debates. When two people argue, they rarely listen to each other. Instead, they try to prove why they are right. It becomes a battle, not a discussion. This is called the preacher, prosecutor, and politician mindset. A preacher defends their beliefs and tries to convince others that they are right. A prosecutor looks for mistakes in other people's arguments and tries to prove them wrong. A politician tries to win approval by agreeing with what people want to hear. But none of these roles help us rethink. They only make us more stubborn. The better way is to think like a scientist. Scientists don't just try to prove they are right. They test their ideas. They look at evidence. If something doesn't work, they change their approach. This is the mindset we need to develop in everyday life. Let's take an example. Imagine you always believed that a certain type of food is unhealthy. But then, new research comes out saying it's actually good for you. What do? If you think like a preacher, you ignore the research because it doesn't match what you believed. If you think like a prosecutor, you try to find flaws in the study to prove it wrong. If you think like a politician, you agree with whatever most people around you believe. But if you think like a scientist, you look at the evidence. You stay curious. You ask, what if I was wrong? Instead of defending your old belief, you test it. If the new information makes sense, you change your mind. And that's okay. Changing your mind doesn't mean you were foolish before. It means you are growing. The smartest people in the world are not the ones who never change their minds. They are the ones who are willing to. But here's the challenge. How do we train our minds to rethink? It starts with small steps. First, practice saying, I might be wrong. These 4 words can open your mind to new possibilities. Instead of arguing, start asking questions. Instead of defending, start exploring. Second, surround yourself with people who think differently. If you only talk to people who agree with you, you will never grow. But if you listen to different perspectives, you will learn more than you ever thought possible. Third, make it a habit to update your beliefs. Just like we update our phones and computers, we need to update our minds. If new information comes in, don't ignore it. Examine it. Test it. And if it makes sense, let it change you. Rethinking is not easy. It takes courage. It takes effort. But in the end, it makes us wiser, stronger, and more open to the truth. If rethinking is so important, then why don't we do it more often? One of the biggest reasons is the environment we are in. Our surroundings, the people we talk to, and the information we consume all shape how we think. If we are surrounded by people who never question their beliefs, we are less likely to question our own. If we only hear one side of a story, we might believe it's the only truth. This is why creating an environment that encourages rethinking is so important. Think about workplaces. In many companies, people are rewarded for sticking to the plan and following instructions. If someone questions an old rule or suggests a different way of doing things, they might be ignored or even punished. Over time, employees learn that it's safer to stay silent than to rethink. The same happens in schools. Students are taught to memorize facts instead of questioning them. If they challenge a teacher's idea, they might be seen as disrespectful instead of curious. This kind of environment stops people from growing. It makes them afraid to speak up, afraid to ask questions, and afraid to change their minds. But the best organizations, schools, and teams do things differently. They create a culture where rethinking is normal, where people are encouraged to ask, "Is there a better way?" One way to do this is by normalizing mistakes. When people are afraid of being wrong, they avoid rethinking because they don't want to look foolish. But if mistakes are seen as part of the learning process, people feel safe to question themselves and improve. The most successful teams are the ones that treat failures as lessons, not as reasons for punishment. Another way to build a rethinking culture is through constructive conflict. Many people think that disagreements are bad, but the truth is, the right kind of conflict helps us grow. When we have healthy debates, we get exposed to different perspectives. Instead of attacking each other, we learn from each other. The goal is not to win an argument, but to discover the best answer together. For example, some of the most innovative companies encourage what they call challenge networks. These are groups of people who are not afraid to question ideas, no matter how experienced the person presenting them is. In these companies, leaders don't just surround themselves with people who agree with them. Instead, they invite people who will push them to think again. History has shown that those who challenge the status quo often lead to the biggest breakthroughs. Think about scientists who discovered new medical treatments, inventors who created life-changing technology, or activists who fought for social change. They didn't just accept what they were told. They questioned. They rethought. They kept their minds open to new possibilities. But what about our personal lives? How can we create an environment that supports rethinking in our everyday interactions? One simple way is by practicing active listening. Instead of listening to respond, we should listen to understand. When someone shares an opinion different from ours, instead of immediately rejecting it, we can ask, "What makes you think that?" This small change in how we listen can lead to deeper conversations and better learning. Another important habit is to seek out information that challenges our views. Too often, we only read or watch things that confirm what we already believe. This is called a confirmation bias. It makes us feel comfortable, but it stops us from learning. Instead, we should make an effort to explore different perspectives, even if they make us uncomfortable. Rethinking is not about changing our minds all the time. It's about being open to change when the evidence supports it. It's about staying curious, asking better questions, and creating spaces where learning never stops. The more we practice, the better we become at seeing the world not as it was yesterday, but as it is today. One of the biggest challenges in rethinking is overcoming the mental traps that keep us stuck. Even when we want to be open-minded, our brains naturally resist change. Understanding these mental traps is the first step in learning how to escape them. One common trap is the confirmation bias. This happens when we only look for information that supports what we already believe. Instead of searching for the truth, we search for proof that we are right. This is why two people can look at the same set of facts and come to completely different conclusions. They are filtering the information through their existing beliefs. For example, imagine two people watching the same political debate. If one person already supports a candidate, they will focus on the moments where the candidate looks strong. If the other person dislikes that candidate, they will notice every mistake. They are both watching the same event, but their minds are selecting the details that fit what they already believe. This is why changing someone's mind with facts alone is so difficult. People don't just accept new facts, they interpret them in a way that protects their existing beliefs. Another trap is the overconfidence cycle. Many people assume that confidence comes from knowledge. The more we know, the more confident we feel. But the reality is, the less we know, the more confident we often feel. This is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with little knowledge on a topic often overestimate their expertise, while true experts are more aware of what they don't know. Think about someone who has just started learning about investing. After watching a few videos, they feel like they have mastered the stock market. They make big decisions with full confidence, even though their understanding is still shallow. Meanwhile, professional investors who have spent years studying the market are often more cautious because they know how unpredictable it can be. This is why it's so important to stay humble. When we think we know everything, we stop learning. But when we recognize that we don't know everything, we stay curious and keep improving. Instead of thinking, "I'm sure I'm right," we should ask, "What if I'm wrong?" This small shift in thinking can open the door to new insights. A third mental trap is identity attachment. Many of our beliefs are tied to who we are. If we believe that we are intelligent, strong, or ethical, we might resist any information that challenges that image. If someone tells us we are wrong about something important, it can feel like they are attacking our very identity. This is why people often take disagreements so personally. Imagine a doctor who has been using the same treatment for years. If new research comes out showing that there is a better method, they might reject it, not because the evidence is weak, but because changing their approach would mean admitting that they were wrong in the past. The same thing happens in everyday life. If someone has believed something for a long time, asking them to rethink it is not just asking them to change their mind, it's asking them to change part of who they are. The best way to escape identity attachment is to separate what we believe from who we are. Instead of saying, "I am a supporter of this idea," we can say, "I currently believe this idea, but I am open to changing my mind." This way, if new evidence comes in, we can update our beliefs without feeling like we are losing ourselves. A great example of this comes from scientists. The best scientists don't attach their identities to their theories. Instead, they see themselves as explorers of truth. If a new discovery proves their old idea wrong, they don't take it personally. They see it as progress. They are excited to learn something new. This mindset can be useful in everyday life. If someone challenges our beliefs, instead of getting defensive, we can ask, "What can I learn from this?" If we make a mistake, instead of feeling embarrassed, we can see it as an opportunity to grow. If we realize that we were wrong about something, we can feel proud that we had the courage to change our minds. Escaping these mental traps takes practice. It requires us to slow down and question our own thinking. It means being willing to say, "I don't know," and being comfortable with uncertainty. But the more we do it, the better we become at seeing the world as it truly is, not just as we want it to be. If we want to get better at rethinking, we need to change the way we approach conversations. Most of the time, when we talk to others, we are trying to convince them of something. We want to prove that we are right. But if our goal is to learn and grow, then we need to change how we communicate. Instead of acting like a preacher, a prosecutor, or a politician, we should learn to think like a scientist. A preacher tries to spread their beliefs and make others follow them. They are not open to changing their minds because they already believe they have the truth. A prosecutor tries to prove others wrong. They focus on finding flaws in the other person's argument instead of questioning their own. A politician tries to win people's approval. They say things that will make others agree with them, even if they are not fully convinced themselves. We all fall into these roles at different times. When we strongly believe in something, we preach. When we argue, we prosecute. When we try to fit in, we act like politicians. The problem is that none of these roles encourage rethinking. Instead of listening and learning, we become stuck in our own positions. A scientist, on the other hand, is different. A scientist does not start with a conclusion and then look for proof. They start with a question and test their ideas with experiments. If the evidence proves them wrong, they update their beliefs. They do not see being wrong as a failure, they see it as progress. Thinking like a scientist means being curious. It means asking, what evidence would change my mind? Instead of trying to win arguments, we should try to understand different perspectives. Instead of trying to prove that we are right, we should look for the truth, even if it means admitting we were wrong. One way to do this is to ask better questions. Many people ask questions to trap others in a debate. They ask things like, "Don't you think that's a bad idea?" Or, "How can you believe that?" These questions are designed to make the other person defend themselves. But if we truly want to rethink, we should ask open-ended questions. For example, instead of saying, "That's wrong," we can ask, "What led you to that belief?" Instead of saying, "You should change your mind," we can ask, "What kind of evidence would make you rethink your position?" These kinds of questions open the door for thoughtful discussions instead of arguments. Another important skill is active listening. Most of the time, when someone is talking, we are not really listening. We are just waiting for our turn to speak. We are thinking about how to respond instead of trying to understand the other person's point of view. Active listening means focusing fully on what the other person is saying. It means asking follow-up questions instead of jumping to conclusions. It means repeating back what we heard to make sure we understood correctly. When people feel heard, they are more likely to open up and reconsider their views. One of the biggest benefits of thinking like a scientist is that it makes us more flexible. When we are too attached to our beliefs, we become stubborn. We hold on to ideas even when they no longer make sense. But when we treat our beliefs like hypotheses instead of absolute truths, we can update them as we learn more. This kind of thinking is especially important in today's world, where information changes quickly. What was true yesterday might not be true today. The best thinkers are not the ones who never change their minds. They are the ones who are willing to adapt when new evidence comes in. This does not mean we should change our minds all the time. It means we should be open to rethinking when there is a good reason to do so. We should be willing to challenge our own assumptions and consider different perspectives. When we start thinking like scientists, we stop seeing conversations as battles to be won. Instead, we see them as opportunities to learn. We become less defensive, more curious, and more open to change. We realize that being wrong is not something to be ashamed of. It is a natural part of growth. One of the most important parts of rethinking is learning how to deal with disagreements. Most people see disagreements as conflicts. When someone has a different opinion than us, we often feel the need to defend ourselves. We argue, debate, and try to prove that we are right. But what if disagreements could actually make us smarter? Research shows that the best decisions are made when people are exposed to different viewpoints. When we only surround ourselves with people who agree with us, we become trapped in a bubble. We hear the same ideas repeated over and over again, which makes us feel more certain that we are right. But certainty is not the same as truth. The more we hear only one side of an argument, the harder it becomes to see the flaws in our thinking. The best way to break out of this bubble is to engage with people who think differently. This does not mean arguing with them. It means having thoughtful discussions where we try to understand their perspective. It means being open to the possibility that they might have a point. When we expose ourselves to different opinions, we challenge our own thinking and we sharpen our ideas. There are two types of disagreements. The first type is destructive disagreement. This is the kind of argument where people attack each other instead of the idea. They raise their voices, insult each other, and refuse to listen. These arguments do not lead to learning. They only make people more stubborn. The second type is constructive disagreement. This happens when people challenge each other's ideas with respect. They listen carefully, ask thoughtful questions, and consider new perspectives. Instead of trying to win the argument, they focus on finding the best possible answer. This kind of disagreement can be incredibly valuable. It forces us to rethink, refine our ideas, and make better decisions. One way to encourage constructive disagreement is to avoid the natural instinct to immediately reject opposing views. When we hear something we disagree with, our first reaction is often to say, "That's wrong." Instead, we should pause and ask, what if there is some truth in this? For example, imagine a business leader who believes that employees should always work from the office. They think remote work makes people less productive. Now, imagine they meet someone who believes the opposite, that remote work actually makes employees more productive. Instead of immediately dismissing this idea, the leader could ask, what evidence do they have? Are there examples where remote work has improved performance? Could there be a middle ground? This approach turns a disagreement into a learning opportunity. Instead of shutting down the conversation, it keeps the discussion open. It creates a space where both sides can rethink their positions and possibly find a better solution. Another strategy for better disagreements is learning to argue like scientists. Scientists do not argue to prove they are right. They argue to find the best possible explanation. They present their evidence, but they are also willing to change their minds if better evidence comes along. One of the best ways to practice this is by using something called complexity mindset. This means recognizing that most issues are not simple. They are complicated and have many layers. Instead of thinking in black and white, we should learn to see the shades of gray. For example, many people have strong opinions about climate change, healthcare, or education policies. But these issues are not simple. They have many factors, and different perspectives can provide valuable insights. Instead of saying, "This is completely right and that is completely wrong," we can say, "This idea has some good points, but it also has weaknesses. Let's explore both sides." This kind of thinking makes us better problem solvers. It helps us find creative solutions instead of getting stuck in endless debates. It also makes us better communicators because people are more likely to listen to us when they feel that we are open-minded. A great example of productive disagreement comes from successful business teams. Research has found that the best teams do not always agree. In fact, the most innovative companies encourage employees to challenge each other's ideas. When done respectfully, this leads to better decisions and stronger strategies. Instead of fearing disagreements, they see them as a way to refine their thinking. The key to productive disagreement is psychological safety. This means creating an environment where people feel safe to express their thoughts, even if those thoughts go against the majority. When people are afraid of being judged, they stay silent. But when they feel safe, they share ideas, ask questions, and help the group think more critically. In everyday life, we can create psychological safety in conversations by showing that we respect different opinions. We can do this by listening without interrupting, acknowledging good points, and admitting when we do not have all the answers. When people see that we are open to discussion, they are more willing to engage in meaningful conversations. Another important skill is knowing when to agree to disagree. Not every disagreement needs to end with one person changing their mind. Sometimes the best outcome is to understand each other better, even if we do not fully agree. The goal of rethinking is not to force others to accept our views. It is to keep an open mind, explore different perspectives, and make better decisions based on what we learn. When we stop seeing disagreements as battles and start seeing them as opportunities, we become better thinkers. We improve our ability to adapt, solve problems, and communicate effectively. We learn that the best ideas are not the ones that win the loudest arguments, but the ones that survive the most thoughtful discussions. Many people believe that confidence comes from knowing all the answers. They think that if they are sure about their beliefs and never change their minds, they will be seen as strong and intelligent. But true confidence is not about being certain all the time. It is about being comfortable with uncertainty. It is about knowing that you do not have all the answers, but you are willing to search for them. There is a difference between confidence and arrogance. Arrogance is when someone believes they are always right, no matter what. They refuse to consider new evidence or different perspectives. They mistake stubbornness for strength. But this kind of thinking does not make a person smarter. In fact, it limits their ability to grow and improve. Real confidence is different. It is the ability to say, "I do not know, but I am willing to learn." Confident people are not afraid to admit their mistakes. They are not afraid to change their opinions when they find better evidence. This kind of confidence is much stronger than arrogance because it allows a person to keep improving. One way to develop this kind of confidence is through something called confident humility. This means believing in your ability to figure things out while also recognizing that you might be wrong. It is the balance between knowing your strengths and accepting your limitations. Imagine a doctor who has been practicing for many years. They have seen thousands of patients and have deep knowledge of medicine. But instead of assuming they know everything, they continue to learn. They read new research, consult with other doctors, and ask for second opinions. They are confident in their ability, but they are also humble enough to know that science is always evolving. This makes them a much better doctor than someone who refuses to update their knowledge. The same principle applies in every field. The best leaders, teachers, and experts are not the ones who pretend to know everything. They are the ones who keep learning, questioning, and adapting. One way to develop confident humility is to embrace the idea that being wrong is not a weakness. Many people fear being wrong because they think it makes them look foolish. But in reality, the willingness to admit mistakes is a sign of strength. It shows that a person values truth more than their ego. For example, in business, many successful companies have made big mistakes. But the ones that survive are those that recognize their errors quickly and adapt. They do not waste time defending bad decisions. Instead, they rethink their strategies and move forward with better plans. Another way to practice confident humility is to surround yourself with people who challenge you. Many people only spend time with those who agree with them. This makes them feel comfortable, but it also makes them overconfident in their beliefs. A better approach is to have thoughtful discussions with people who have different viewpoints. This forces you to think more deeply and refine your ideas. A great example of this comes from research on top-performing students. Studies have found that the best students are not always the ones who believe they are the smartest. Instead, they are the ones who question their own understanding the most. They ask more questions, seek feedback, and are not afraid to admit when they do not know something. This mindset helps them learn faster and perform better in the long run. One powerful exercise to develop confident humility is to keep a rethinking journal. This is a simple habit where you write down things you believed strongly in the past but have since changed your mind about. It could be a political opinion, a career decision, or even a personal habit. The goal is to remind yourself that changing your mind is a normal and healthy part of growth. For example, someone might write in their journal, "I used to believe that working long hours was the best way to be successful, but after learning about work-life balance, I now see that rest and breaks actually make me more productive." Looking back at these moments helps reinforce the idea that rethinking is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of learning. Another strategy is to actively seek out disconfirming evidence. This means looking for information that goes against your beliefs instead of just looking for things that confirm what you already think. This is difficult because the human brain naturally prefers information that supports what we already believe. But the best thinkers train themselves to do the opposite. For instance, if someone strongly believes that a particular diet is the best, instead of only reading articles that support their view, they should also explore studies that challenge it. This does not mean they have to change their mind right away, but it helps them see the full picture and make a more informed decision. Confident humility also improves relationships. Many arguments happen because people feel the need to be right. But when we approach conversations with curiosity instead of defensiveness, we create more meaningful connections. Instead of saying, "You are wrong," we can ask, "What led you to that belief?" Instead of trying to prove a point, we can listen and learn. This mindset is especially important in leadership. The best leaders are not those who act like they have all the answers. They are the ones who encourage their teams to share ideas, challenge assumptions, and work together to find the best solutions. They create an environment where people feel safe to speak up, even if their opinions are different. In the end, confident humility is about replacing the fear of being wrong with the excitement of learning. It is about seeing mistakes not as failures but as opportunities for growth. It is about recognizing that intelligence is not measured by how often you are right but by how willing you are to rethink and adapt. One of the biggest obstacles to rethinking is the human tendency to stick to our existing beliefs, even when new evidence suggests we might be wrong. This happens because of something called cognitive laziness. Our brains like to take shortcuts. Instead of questioning everything, we often go with what feels familiar or comfortable. This saves time and energy, but it also makes us resistant to change. Imagine a person who has always believed that success comes only from hard work. They might ignore stories of people who achieved success through creativity, teamwork, or smart decision-making. Even when they see evidence that hard work alone is not enough, they dismiss it because it does not fit their worldview. This is called the confirmation bias. It means we tend to accept information that supports what we already believe and reject anything that challenges it. Another common problem is the identity trap. People often tie their beliefs to their sense of who they are. For example, if someone identifies as a certain type of person, like a strong leader, a traditional thinker, or a loyal employee, they may resist any idea that threatens this identity. If a leader believes they must always be in control, they might ignore advice from their team. If an employee sees themselves as hardworking, they may refuse to accept feedback about improving efficiency. The more closely a belief is tied to our identity, the harder it is to change. This is why debates often become personal. Instead of discussing ideas, people feel like they are defending their entire identity. They react emotionally instead of thinking logically. This makes learning and growth very difficult. So how do we overcome these mental traps? One way is to separate our beliefs from our identity. Instead of saying, "I am a hardworking person, so I must always work long hours," we can say, "I value hard work, but I am open to learning better ways to work efficiently." Instead of saying, "I am a strong leader, so I must always have the answers," We can say, I strive to be a strong leader, and part of that means listening to others. This small change in mindset makes a big difference. It allows us to rethink without feeling like we are losing ourselves. It helps us stay open to new perspectives without feeling threatened. Another useful approach is called scientific thinking. Scientists do not just try to prove they are right. They actively try to find out if they are wrong. They form a hypothesis, test it, and if the results do not support their idea, they change their approach. Good scientists are always updating their knowledge based on new discoveries. We can apply this same thinking to our daily lives. Instead of treating our opinions like final answers, we can treat them like hypotheses. We can say, this is my current understanding, but I am open to new information. This way, if we realize we are wrong, it is not a failure, it is just part of learning. Another technique is to practice motivational interviewing. This is a way of having conversations where instead of arguing, we ask thoughtful questions. If someone disagrees with us, instead of trying to convince them right away, we can ask, what makes you believe that? Or what evidence would change your mind? This encourages both sides to think more deeply and opens the door for real discussion instead of just debate. For example, imagine someone strongly believes that one particular diet is the best for everyone. Instead of arguing, we can ask, what led you to that belief? And are there any cases where this diet might not work? When people reflect on their own thinking, they are more likely to consider new possibilities. Practicing curiosity is another way to challenge rigid thinking. Curious people ask questions, explore different viewpoints, and enjoy learning. They do not feel the need to have all the answers right away. They see every conversation as an opportunity to grow. To develop curiosity, we can make a habit of asking what if and why questions. Instead of just accepting things as they are, we can ask, why do we do things this way? And what if we tried a different approach? This kind of thinking leads to new ideas and better solutions. One interesting example of this is in the business world. Many successful companies did not start with a perfect plan. Instead, they kept rethinking and adapting. Netflix, for example, started as a DVD rental company. But instead of sticking to their original model, they questioned it. They asked, what if people could stream movies online instead? Because they were willing to rethink, they became one of the biggest entertainment companies in the world. The same applies to personal growth. The most successful people are not just those who work hard, but those who learn how to adapt. They do not see failure as a sign to stop. They see it as feedback that helps them improve. A simple way to practice this is by doing a rethinking check-in. Every few months, we can ask ourselves, what is one belief I have changed recently? And what is something I used to believe strongly but now see differently? This helps train our minds to stay flexible and open. Breaking free from old beliefs is not always easy. It takes effort to challenge our own thinking. But when we do, we open the door to better decisions, stronger relationships, and greater success. One of the most powerful ways to rethink is by learning how to have better conversations. Often, when people discuss ideas, they are not really listening to each other. Instead, they are waiting for their turn to speak, preparing arguments in their minds while the other person is talking. This creates a debate rather than a real discussion. The goal in a debate is to win, but the goal in a meaningful conversation should be to learn. To rethink effectively, we need to improve the way we communicate with others. One way to do this is by replacing arguing with listening. When we truly listen, we do not just hear words, we try to understand the other person's perspective. We ask questions, show curiosity, and make the other person feel heard. When people feel heard, they become more open to hearing what we have to say. One of the biggest mistakes we make in conversations is what psychologists call the righting reflex. This means we have an automatic urge to correct people when we think they are wrong. If someone says something we disagree with, we quickly jump in with counterarguments. But instead of changing their minds, this usually makes them dig in deeper. People become defensive when they feel attacked. They feel the need to protect their beliefs rather than reconsider them. A better approach is called motivational interviewing. This technique was originally developed to help people overcome bad habits, but it is also useful for changing minds in any situation. The idea is simple. Instead of telling people they are wrong, we ask them open-ended questions that make them reflect on their own beliefs. For example, if someone is strongly against a new policy at work, instead of saying, "You're wrong, and here's why," we can ask, "What concerns you the most about this policy?" Or what would need to happen for you to feel differently about it? These kinds of questions make people think more deeply instead of just defending their position. Another useful technique is finding common ground before discussing differences. When two people disagree, they often focus on their conflicts right away. This makes the conversation feel like a battle. But when we start with something we both agree on, we create a foundation of trust. For example, if two people have different views on education, they can start by agreeing that they both want children to get the best learning experience. This makes it easier to discuss their differences in a respectful way. A great example of how rethinking conversations can work comes from a famous study in which researchers tried to change people's opinions on a highly emotional topic: immigration. Instead of arguing facts, they asked people to share personal experiences related to immigration. When people told stories about their own family histories or encounters with immigrants, they became more open to seeing the issue in a new way. This shows that personal stories can be more powerful than facts alone. Another important part of rethinking is learning to admit when we are wrong. Many people see changing their mind as a weakness. They think it means they were not smart enough in the first place. But in reality, admitting mistakes is a sign of intelligence and confidence. It shows that we are more committed to getting things right than just being right. A famous example of this comes from the world of science. In the 19th century, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that doctors could save lives by washing their hands before treating patients. At first, many doctors refused to believe him because it went against what they had always done. They did not want to admit they had been making a deadly mistake. As a result, thousands of lives were lost before hand-washing became standard practice. This shows how dangerous it can be to resist rethinking, even when the evidence is clear. In contrast, great leaders and thinkers throughout history have embraced rethinking. Take Charles Darwin, for example. He started his scientific career believing in the traditional idea that species never change. But when he gathered new evidence, he was willing to question his own beliefs. This led him to develop the theory of evolution, one of the most important scientific breakthroughs of all time. Another example is Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. One of his leadership principles is the idea of strong opinions loosely held. This means he encourages people to have clear opinions based on evidence, but to be willing to change them when new data emerges. This mindset has helped Amazon stay innovative and successful. To develop this habit in our own lives, we can practice what Adam Grant calls a challenge network. A challenge network is a group of people who do not just agree with us but who push us to think more deeply. These are people who question our ideas, point out flaws, and force us to consider new perspectives. Having a challenge network helps us stay open-minded and prevents us from becoming too attached to our own opinions. Rethinking is not just about changing our minds when we are wrong. It is also about being comfortable with uncertainty. Many people feel anxious when they do not have all the answers. But uncertainty is a natural part of life. The best thinkers do not rush to conclusions just to feel certain. Instead, they stay curious, keep asking questions, and remain open to new possibilities. One way to embrace uncertainty is by thinking like a scientist. Scientists do not expect to be right all the time. They expect to learn. They test ideas, look at evidence, and adjust their views when needed. We can apply this to our daily lives by replacing certainty with curiosity. Instead of saying, "I know this is true," we can say, "I wonder if this is true." Instead of saying, "This is the best way," we can say, "Let's test if this is the best way." When we approach life with this mindset, we become better learners, better decision makers, and better problem solvers. We stop seeing mistakes as failures and start seeing them as opportunities to grow. And most importantly, we become more open to change, which allows us to adapt and succeed in a world that is always evolving. One of the biggest obstacles to rethinking is our natural tendency to seek confirmation instead of truth. This means that when we have a belief, we look for information that supports it rather than evidence that challenges it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. It is one of the main reasons why people struggle to change their minds, even when presented with strong evidence. For example, if someone believes that a certain diet is the best for weight loss, they will read articles and watch videos that support their belief. They will ignore or dismiss studies that suggest otherwise. If they come across a person who lost weight using a different method, they may say, "That's just one example. My way still works better." This happens because people do not like to be wrong. Being wrong feels uncomfortable, so they try to protect their beliefs instead of questioning them. A similar bias is called the desirability bias. This is when we believe something simply because we want it to be true. Imagine a person who strongly supports a political leader. They want this leader to be good, so they ignore any negative news about them. Even if there is clear evidence that the leader made mistakes, they will find ways to explain it away. This bias makes it hard for people to accept inconvenient truths. Another problem is the identity trap. Many people tie their beliefs to their identity. When this happens, changing their minds feels like changing who they are. If someone sees themselves as a smart investor and then loses money on a bad stock, they might refuse to admit their mistake. Accepting the truth would mean questioning their own intelligence. Instead, they may hold on to the idea that the stock will recover, even when all signs point to failure. This is why it is important to separate our opinions from our identity. Instead of saying, "I am a smart investor," we should say, "I am someone who tries to make smart investments." The first statement makes intelligence a fixed part of who we are. The second statement allows room for growth. If we make a bad decision, we can learn from it without feeling like we have failed as a person. A great way to break free from these biases is by thinking like a scientist. Scientists do not start with conclusions. They start with questions. They form hypotheses, test them, and adjust their views based on the results. They do not see being wrong as a failure. Instead, they see it as progress. Each mistake brings them closer to the truth. One of the best ways to think like a scientist is to practice what Adam Grant calls counterfactual thinking. This means asking, what would have happened if I had made a different choice? For example, if someone starts a business and it fails, they can ask, what if I had launched it in a different market? Or, what if I had tested the product more before selling it? These questions help them learn from experience instead of simply feeling bad about their failure. Counterfactual thinking is also useful in everyday decisions. If we get into an argument, we can ask, what if I had listened more instead of interrupting? If we struggle with a project at work, we can ask, what if I had asked for feedback earlier? These kinds of questions make us better at learning from our past. Another technique is called temporal distancing. This means looking at our current beliefs from the perspective of our future self. Imagine yourself 5 or 10 years from now. Will you still believe the same things? If not, what might cause you to change your mind? This exercise helps us realize that many of our opinions are temporary. It reminds us that we are constantly growing and learning. A useful example comes from the world of sports. Many athletes change their techniques over time. A basketball player who once believed that a certain shooting style was the best may later switch to a different method after working with a new coach. If they had been too stubborn to rethink their approach, they would not have improved. The same applies to all areas of life. Growth requires change, and change requires rethinking. Another important skill is learning how to accept constructive criticism. Many people become defensive when someone points out their mistakes. They see criticism as a personal attack instead of a learning opportunity. But the best way to grow is to surround ourselves with people who challenge us. One of the most valuable types of feedback is what Adam Grant calls disagreeable givers. These are people who may not always be nice, but they care enough to tell us the truth. They do not just say what we want to hear. Instead, they push us to be better. They are different from agreeable takers, who act friendly but do not really care about our success. A good example of a disagreeable giver is a tough coach. Imagine a sports coach who constantly points out a player's mistakes. The player may not like it in the moment, but over time they improve. If the coach had only given compliments, the player would not have reached their full potential. This idea applies to workplaces too. A great manager is not someone who only praises employees. They also give honest feedback, even when it is uncomfortable. The best teams are those where people feel safe challenging each other. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations, they embrace them. To get better at accepting criticism, we can practice what psychologists call detaching the self from the idea. This means seeing feedback as information rather than an attack. If someone says, "Your presentation could have been clearer," we do not have to take it personally. Instead of thinking, "I am bad at presenting," we can think, "There is room for improvement and I can learn." One of the biggest mistakes people make is only listening to feedback when it is delivered in a nice way. If someone is blunt or harsh, they ignore it. But valuable advice does not always come in a polite package. Instead of focusing on the tone, we should focus on the content. If the criticism is useful, we should take it seriously, no matter how it is delivered. Another way to rethink effectively is by adopting what psychologists call a growth mindset. This means believing that our abilities are not fixed. Instead of thinking, "I am either good or bad at something," we should think, "I can improve with effort." People with a growth mindset see challenges as opportunities rather than threats. A famous example of this comes from the world of education. In a study, students who were taught to see intelligence as something that can grow performed better in school. They did not give up when they struggled. Instead, they saw difficulties as a sign that they were learning. This mindset helps in all areas of life. It makes us more resilient and more open to change. The truth is, we all have blind spots. No matter how much we know, there is always more to learn. The smartest people are not those who have all the answers. They are the ones who keep asking questions. They are the ones who surround themselves with people who challenge them. They are the ones who are willing to change their minds. The ability to rethink is not just a skill, it is a habit. It is something we can practice every day. We can start by questioning our own assumptions. We can seek out different perspectives. We can listen more and argue less. When we do this, we open the door to new possibilities. We make better decisions. And most importantly, we continue to grow. One of the most important aspects of rethinking is learning how to navigate disagreements. Many people see arguments as battles to be won. They focus on proving themselves right instead of trying to understand the other person's perspective. But if our goal is to grow and learn, we need to approach disagreements differently. A common mistake people make in debates is assuming that the louder they argue, the more persuasive they will be. But in reality, pushing too hard often makes others resist even more. This happens because of a psychological effect called the backfire effect. When people feel attacked, they become even more defensive. Instead of listening to new information, they double down on their existing beliefs. A better approach is to engage in what Adam Grant calls arguing like a scientist. This means focusing on facts rather than emotions. It also means being willing to change our own minds if the evidence suggests we are wrong. Instead of trying to win the argument, we should aim to have a thoughtful discussion where both sides can learn something new. One way to do this is by using the technique of complexifying. This means showing that issues are not black and white. Many people see things in extremes. They think something is either completely right or completely wrong. But most of the time, the truth is more complicated. For example, imagine two people arguing about whether technology is good or bad for society. One person says, "Technology is making our lives worse because people are addicted to their phones." The other person says, "Technology is making our lives better because it connects people across the world." Instead of choosing a side, a better approach would be to say, technology has both positive and negative effects. While it helps us connect, it can also be distracting. The real question is how we use it in a balanced way. By acknowledging complexity, we encourage deeper thinking. People are more likely to reconsider their views when they see that the issue is not just black and white. Another powerful strategy in disagreements is asking open-ended questions. Many debates go nowhere because people keep repeating their own points without listening. Instead of saying, "You're wrong," we can ask, "What makes you believe that?" Or, "Have you ever considered another perspective?" Questions encourage people to think more deeply about their own beliefs. Sometimes they may even realize that their views are based on weak arguments. One of the most interesting examples of this comes from a technique called street epistemology. This is a method of conversation where people ask gentle but thought-provoking questions to help others reflect on their beliefs. Instead of attacking ideas directly, they ask things like, "What evidence would change your mind?" Or, "How confident are you in your belief on a scale from 1 to 10? This makes people more open to rethinking because it does not put them on the defensive. Another key aspect of successful disagreements is knowing when to step back. Not every argument is worth having. Sometimes, people are so closed-minded that no amount of reasoning will change their views. In such cases, it is better to walk away than waste time and energy on a pointless debate. There is also a big difference between debating to learn and debating to win. If we approach disagreements with curiosity instead of aggression, we are more likely to have meaningful conversations. Instead of trying to be right, we should try to understand. Instead of trying to change others, we should focus on exploring ideas together. This approach does not mean that we should always agree with others. It simply means that we should be open to discussion and willing to update our beliefs when necessary. Being flexible in our thinking does not make us weak. It makes us wiser. Another important idea in rethinking is learning how to influence others effectively. Many people assume that giving more facts and data will automatically convince someone. But research shows that logic alone is not enough. People do not just change their minds because of information. They change when they feel safe, respected, and understood. One of the best ways to influence someone is through what psychologists call motivational interviewing. This is a method often used by therapists and counselors to help people change their behavior. Instead of telling someone what they should do, they guide them to reach their own conclusions. For example, if someone is struggling to quit smoking, a typical approach might be to say, "Smoking is bad for you. You should stop." But this kind of direct advice often makes people resist. A better approach is to ask, "What are some reasons you want to quit smoking?" Or, "How do you feel about the impact smoking has on your health?" When people come up with their own reasons for change, they are more likely to take action. This same principle applies to everyday conversations. Instead of pushing people to see things our way, we can guide them to discover insights on their own. Instead of arguing, we can listen. Instead of telling people what to do, we can ask questions that make them think. Another effective strategy is using affirmation before contradiction. This means starting by acknowledging something we agree on before presenting a different perspective. If we immediately challenge someone's view, they may become defensive. But if we first find common ground, they are more likely to be open to rethinking. For example, imagine someone strongly believes that hard work is the only factor in success. Instead of saying, "That's not true, luck also matters," we can start with, I agree that hard work is important. Many successful people put in a lot of effort. At the same time, research also shows that factors like timing, connections, and luck can play a role. What do you think about that? This approach makes people feel heard and respected, making them more open to new ideas. Another powerful way to influence people is by leading by example. People are more likely to change their views when they see others practicing what they preach. If we want others to rethink, we must first be willing to rethink ourselves. If we want others to be open-minded, we must show that we are open-minded too. A great example of this comes from leaders who admit their mistakes. Many people believe that showing confidence means never changing their minds. But in reality, true confidence comes from the ability to admit when we are wrong. When a leader says, "I used to believe this, but I have learned something new," they set a powerful example for others. They show that rethinking is not a sign of weakness but a strength. One of the biggest myths about influence is that being forceful is the best way to persuade. In reality, people do not like feeling pressured. The harder we push, the more they resist. A more effective approach is to create an environment where people feel free to explore new ideas without fear of judgment. This is why psychological safety is so important in workplaces, schools, and relationships. When people feel safe to express their thoughts without being attacked, they are more willing to rethink. When they know that changing their minds will not make them look weak, they are more open to learning. Rethinking is not just about changing individual opinions. It is also about creating a culture where open-mindedness is valued. It is about building environments where people feel comfortable questioning assumptions. It is about encouraging curiosity, embracing uncertainty, and recognizing that growth comes from learning, not from always being right. One of the biggest obstacles to rethinking is the fear of being wrong. Many people feel that admitting a mistake makes them look weak or foolish. But the truth is, refusing to rethink can be far more damaging in the long run. When we hold on to outdated beliefs or wrong ideas, we limit our ability to grow, learn, and make better decisions. This fear of being wrong is deeply connected to our identity. When we strongly believe in something, it becomes part of who we are. Changing our minds can feel like losing a part of ourselves. For example, if someone has always believed that success is purely based on hard work, they might struggle to accept that privilege, luck, or outside circumstances also play a role. It is not just an intellectual shift, it is an emotional one. This is why people sometimes resist new information, even when the evidence is clear. If a new idea challenges their identity, they may feel threatened. Instead of considering the possibility that they might be wrong, they reject the new idea altogether. This is why people often ignore facts that go against their beliefs and instead look for information that confirms what they already think. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Confirmation bias makes us see what we want to see and ignore what we do not. If we believe something strongly, we tend to pay attention only to the evidence that supports our belief and dismiss anything that contradicts it. This happens in all areas of life, from politics to science to personal relationships. For example, imagine someone who believes that a certain diet is the best way to lose weight. They might read articles that support their belief and ignore studies that show different results. Even if new research proves that another diet is more effective, they may resist changing their opinion because it feels like admitting they were wrong. Overcoming confirmation bias requires a conscious effort. One way to do this is by actively seeking out opposing views. Instead of surrounding ourselves only with people who agree with us, we should engage with different perspectives. This does not mean we have to accept every new idea, but we should at least be willing to consider it. Another way to fight confirmation bias is by keeping a challenge network. A challenge network is a group of people who are not afraid to question us. They help us see flaws in our thinking, point out blind spots, and encourage us to rethink. These are not people who criticize just for the sake of arguing, but those who genuinely want to help us improve our thinking. Many of the most successful thinkers in history relied on challenge networks. They surrounded themselves with people who questioned their ideas, forcing them to refine their arguments and strengthen their reasoning. Instead of avoiding criticism, they welcomed it. This helped them grow, adapt, and make better decisions over time. Another useful strategy for rethinking is to adopt a scientific mindset. Scientists do not see being wrong as a failure. Instead, they see it as part of the process of learning. When an experiment does not work, they do not ignore the results. They analyze them to figure out what went wrong and what they can do better next time. We can apply the same approach in our daily lives. Instead of seeing mistakes as something to be ashamed of, we can see them as opportunities to learn. When we realize we were wrong about something, we should not feel embarrassed. Instead, we should feel proud that we are growing and improving. One of the best examples of this comes from the world of business. Many successful companies have achieved greatness not because they had a perfect strategy from the beginning, but because they were willing to rethink their approach when things were not working. Companies that refuse to adapt often fail, while those that embrace change thrive. For instance, Netflix started as a DVD rental company. But when streaming technology became popular, they realized that DVDs would eventually become obsolete. Instead of holding on to their old business model, they adapted and became one of the biggest streaming platforms in the world. In contrast, companies like Blockbuster, which refused to rethink their strategy, disappeared. The same principle applies to personal growth. The ability to rethink is what allows us to improve in our careers, relationships, and personal lives. It helps us make better decisions, avoid repeating mistakes, and stay open to new opportunities. A key part of rethinking is learning how to detach our opinions from our identity. Instead of defining ourselves by what we believe, we should define ourselves by how willing we are to learn. If we see ourselves as lifelong learners, then changing our minds becomes a natural part of the process. Another important aspect of rethinking is emotional intelligence. Sometimes our emotions get in the way of rational thinking. If we feel strongly about something, we might let our emotions drive our decisions instead of logic. Recognizing this and learning to separate emotions from facts can help us rethink more effectively. For example, if someone gives us feedback that challenges our beliefs, our first reaction might be to feel defensive. But if we take a step back and analyze the feedback objectively, we might realize that it has value. Instead of reacting emotionally, we can use the feedback as a tool for growth. Developing emotional intelligence also helps us in conversations and debates. When discussing a topic with someone who disagrees with us, it is easy to get frustrated or angry. But if we stay calm, listen carefully, and respond thoughtfully, we are more likely to have a productive discussion. Another challenge of rethinking is overcoming the fear of uncertainty. Many people prefer to stick with familiar beliefs because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Not knowing something can make us feel insecure, so we often pretend to be more certain than we actually are. But the truth is, uncertainty is not a weakness. It is a strength. When we admit that we do not know everything, we open ourselves up to new possibilities. Being comfortable with uncertainty allows us to stay curious, explore new ideas, and keep learning throughout our lives. Some of the greatest discoveries in history happened because people were willing to embrace uncertainty. Scientists, inventors, and leaders who were open to new possibilities were the ones who made groundbreaking changes. If they had been afraid of rethinking, they would have never made progress. In everyday life, embracing uncertainty can help us make better decisions. Instead of rushing to conclusions, we can take time to explore different perspectives. Instead of pretending to know everything, we can ask more questions. This mindset helps us stay open to learning and growing. At its core, rethinking is about humility. It is about recognizing that no matter how much we know, there is always more to learn. It is about valuing curiosity over certainty and progress over pride. By practicing rethinking, we become better problem solvers, better decision makers, and ultimately better people. One of the most powerful aspects of rethinking is the ability to change our minds in the face of new evidence. But just knowing that rethinking is important is not enough. We need to practice it in real life, and that requires developing habits that make us more open to change. One of the best ways to do this is by learning how to have better conversations, especially with people who have different views than we do. When we talk to others, we often approach the conversation as if it is a battle. We try to defend our beliefs and prove the other person wrong. But this approach does not encourage learning or growth. Instead, it creates resistance. When people feel attacked, they shut down. They become defensive and are less likely to listen. The same thing happens to us when we feel that someone is challenging our beliefs too aggressively. A better approach is to think of conversations as a way to explore ideas rather than to win an argument. This means asking more questions and listening more than we talk. Instead of trying to convince someone that they are wrong, we should try to understand why they think the way they do. What led them to their beliefs? What experiences shaped their thinking? By being genuinely curious, we create a space where both sides can learn. One technique that works well in difficult conversations is motivational interviewing. This is a method used by therapists to help people change their behavior, but it can also be applied to everyday discussions. Instead of telling someone they are wrong, we ask open-ended questions that encourage them to reflect on their own beliefs. For example, instead of saying, "That is incorrect," we can ask, "What makes you believe that? Have you ever come across information that challenges that idea?" This approach helps people rethink their positions without feeling pressured. It gives them a sense of control over their own learning. Research shows that people are more likely to change their minds when they feel that they have arrived at the conclusion themselves rather than being forced into it. Another important skill in rethinking is recognizing the difference between confidence and arrogance. Confidence is a good thing. It allows us to take action and make decisions. But arrogance is different. Arrogance makes us believe we are always right, even when we are not. It stops us from questioning ourselves and prevents us from learning. To stay confident without becoming arrogant, we need to balance our knowledge with humility. This means being sure of what we know while also being aware of what we do not know. A useful mindset to adopt is what psychologists call confident humility. This is the ability to believe in our strengths while also recognizing our limitations. For example, a doctor who has been practicing medicine for many years might be very skilled in their field. But if they believe they already know everything and stop keeping up with new research, they could make dangerous mistakes. On the other hand, if they remain open to new medical discoveries, they can continue improving and providing the best care for their patients. One way to develop confident humility is to keep a list of things we have changed our minds about. This can be a simple list in a notebook or on our phone. Every time we rethink a belief or update our knowledge based on new information, we write it down. Over time, this helps us see that changing our minds is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of growth. Another strategy is to practice arguing against our own beliefs. This is something that great thinkers and scientists do all the time. Instead of just defending what they already believe, they take the opposite position and try to argue against themselves. This forces them to look at their own ideas more critically and find weaknesses in their thinking. This practice can be helpful in everyday life as well. If we strongly believe something, we can try to make a case for the opposite view. If we struggle to find good arguments, it means our belief is based on strong reasoning. But if we realize there are valid points on the other side, it might be time to rethink our position. Another useful habit is to surround ourselves with people who challenge us. Many of us tend to spend time with people who think like us. This is comfortable, but it does not encourage rethinking. If everyone around us agrees with us, we rarely question our beliefs. But if we regularly talk to people who see things differently, we are forced to think more critically. This does not mean we have to seek out arguments all the time. It simply means that we should be open to engaging with different perspectives. We can do this by reading books and articles from authors we do not always agree with, listening to podcasts from different viewpoints, or having thoughtful discussions with people who have different experiences. One of the biggest barriers to rethinking is our ego. We do not like to be wrong because it feels like a personal failure. But if we separate our beliefs from our identity, it becomes much easier to change our minds. Instead of seeing mistakes as something bad, we can see them as learning opportunities. For example, if someone proves us wrong in a discussion, we can reframe the experience. Instead of feeling embarrassed, we can remind ourselves that we just became smarter. The ability to rethink and learn from mistakes is a skill that makes us stronger, not weaker. Some of the most successful people in history were not the ones who were always right. They were the ones who were willing to question themselves and adapt. Scientists, inventors, and leaders who changed the world were often wrong many times before they got it right. What made them great was not their ability to avoid mistakes, but their willingness to learn from them. One example is Thomas Edison. When he was working on the invention of the light bulb, he failed thousands of times. But he did not see those failures as a problem. Instead, he saw them as steps toward success. He famously said, "I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that will not work." This mindset of constant learning and rethinking is what allowed him to succeed. The same principle applies to everyday life. The more willing we are to rethink, the more we can grow. Whether in our careers, relationships, or personal beliefs, the ability to question ourselves is one of the most powerful skills we can develop. It allows us to improve, adapt, and navigate a world that is constantly changing. Rethinking is not just about changing our own minds. It is also about helping others do the same. But convincing someone to rethink their beliefs is not easy. When people feel attacked, they defend themselves. When they feel pressured, they resist. That is why trying to force someone to change their mind often has the opposite effect. Instead of listening, they become more stubborn. Instead of questioning themselves, they hold on to their beliefs even more strongly. So how do we help others rethink? The first step is to stop acting like a preacher, prosecutor, or politician. These are the three mindsets that make it harder for people to change their views. When we act like a preacher, we try to convince others that we are right and they are wrong. When we act like a prosecutor, we try to prove their beliefs are false. And when we act like a politician, we try to win their approval rather than engaging in honest discussion. None of these approaches encourage learning. Instead, they make people defensive. They feel like they have to protect their beliefs instead of questioning them. A better approach is to act like a scientist. Scientists do not assume they are always right. They test their ideas. They look for evidence. They change their views when they find better explanations. If we take the same approach in conversations, we can create an environment where rethinking feels natural rather than threatening. One way to do this is by asking more questions. Instead of arguing, we can be curious. Instead of attacking someone's beliefs, we can explore them together. For example, if someone strongly believes something, we can ask, "What evidence would change your mind?" This question forces them to think critically about their own position. If they say, "Nothing would change my mind," that is a sign they are not thinking scientifically. But if they can name something that would make them reconsider, then they are open to rethinking. Another useful approach is to highlight contradictions in a gentle way. Sometimes people hold beliefs that do not fit together. But instead of pointing out the contradiction directly, we can ask questions that make them notice it themselves. For example, if someone says they do not trust experts but later uses expert opinions to support their argument, we can ask, "How do you decide which experts to trust?" This encourages them to reflect on their reasoning rather than just defending their position. A third strategy is to agree before disagreeing. Research shows that people are more willing to listen if they feel understood. If we start by finding common ground, they are more likely to stay open to discussion. For example, if someone believes that hard work is the most important factor in success, and we think luck also plays a big role, we can start by agreeing, "I completely agree that hard work is important." Then we can introduce a different perspective. At the same time, I have also noticed that some people work really hard but do not succeed because of factors outside their control. Have you ever seen that happen? This approach makes conversations feel like a shared exploration rather than a battle. Instead of trying to prove someone wrong, we are learning together. This reduces resistance and increases the chances of rethinking. Another important tool for changing minds is storytelling. Facts and logic are important, but they are not always enough. People connect with stories on a deeper level than they do with data. If we want to help someone see things differently, sharing a personal story can be more effective than just listing facts. For example, if we are trying to convince someone that changing their mind is not a sign of weakness, we could tell them about a time when we rethought something important in our own lives. When people hear real experiences, they can relate to them emotionally, and this makes them more open to change. Even when we use the best strategies, not everyone will be willing to rethink. Some people are deeply attached to their beliefs, and no amount of discussion will change their minds. In these cases, it is important to recognize when to walk away. Not every conversation needs to end in agreement. Sometimes, planting a seed of doubt is enough. Over time, that seed might grow into a willingness to rethink. Another thing to remember is that helping others rethink is not about winning arguments. It is about creating a culture where learning and growth are more important than being right. Whether in our families, workplaces, or communities, we can encourage people to question their assumptions and stay open to new ideas. One way to do this is to reward rethinking. In many environments, people are praised for sticking to their beliefs rather than for changing them. But what if we celebrated the moments when people updated their views? What if we saw changing our minds as a sign of wisdom rather than weakness? When leaders, teachers, and parents model rethinking, it becomes easier for everyone to do the same. For example, some of the best companies encourage employees to challenge their own ideas. Instead of rewarding confidence alone, they reward the ability to adapt. Employees are encouraged to run experiments, test different approaches, and update their strategies based on results. This culture of rethinking makes organizations more innovative and successful. Schools can also encourage rethinking by teaching students to question their own assumptions. Instead of focusing only on memorizing facts, teachers can help students develop critical thinking skills. When students learn how to test their own ideas, they become better at learning throughout their lives. Even in our personal lives, we can create an environment where rethinking is normal. If we surround ourselves with people who challenge us in a respectful way, we will naturally become more open to change. If we practice listening rather than just debating, we will learn more from others. If we make curiosity a habit, we will continue growing instead of staying stuck in our old beliefs. At the core of all of this is intellectual humility. This means recognizing that we do not know everything and that we can always learn more. It is the opposite of arrogance. Arrogance makes us believe we are always right, but intellectual humility helps us accept that we could be wrong. It allows us to stay open to new information and adjust our views when necessary. Some of the greatest minds in history had this kind of humility. Scientists like Charles Darwin and Albert Einstein were not afraid to change their ideas when new evidence appeared. They did not see mistakes as failures but as opportunities to improve their understanding. In everyday life, we can practice intellectual humility by reminding ourselves that we might not have all the answers. When we feel certain about something, we can take a moment to ask, "What if I am wrong?" When we hear a different opinion, we can ask, "What can I learn from this?" These small habits can make a big difference in how we think and how we interact with the world. Rethinking is not about constantly doubting ourselves. It is about being flexible and willing to learn. It is about recognizing that changing our minds is not a weakness but a strength. The more we practice it, the more we grow. Rethinking is not just an individual skill. It is something that shapes entire societies. The more people learn to question their assumptions, the more progress we can make together. But rethinking does not happen by accident. It requires a culture that encourages curiosity, open-mindedness, and learning from mistakes. One of the biggest barriers to rethinking is social pressure. People often stick to their beliefs because they fear being judged. They worry that if they change their mind, they will seem weak or inconsistent. But in reality, the ability to rethink is one of the greatest strengths a person can have. Some of the most successful people in history have been those who were willing to change their views when they discovered better ideas. For example, great scientists are known not just for their discoveries, but for their ability to abandon old theories when new evidence emerges. Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant minds in history, changed his own theories multiple times as he learned more about physics. He did not see it as a failure. He saw it as progress. The same is true in business. The most successful companies are not the ones that refuse to change. They are the ones that adapt, experiment, and rethink their strategies when the world shifts. The key to creating a culture of rethinking is to reward people for updating their beliefs rather than just defending them. In many workplaces and schools, people are praised for their confidence, even when they are wrong. But what if we praised people for being flexible instead? What if we celebrated those who admitted their mistakes and learned from them? This shift in mindset could make a huge difference in how people think and grow. In some of the most innovative companies, leaders create an environment where employees feel safe to challenge ideas. Instead of punishing people for speaking up, they encourage debate. They know that if employees are afraid to question decisions, the company will stop learning. But if employees feel comfortable rethinking their approach, the company will keep improving. One way to create this kind of culture is to normalize admitting when we are wrong. When leaders openly talk about their own mistakes, it sets an example for others. It shows that rethinking is not a weakness but a strength. It teaches people that learning is more important than always being right. Another way to encourage rethinking is to surround ourselves with people who challenge us. Too often, we seek out people who agree with us. We prefer to be around those who share our opinions because it feels comfortable. But if we only talk to people who think like us, we miss the chance to see different perspectives. We get stuck in our own way of thinking. The best way to grow is to spend time with people who make us think. This does not mean arguing all the time, but it does mean having honest discussions. It means being open to changing our minds when we hear a better argument. It means valuing learning over being right. In relationships, rethinking can also be a powerful tool. Many conflicts happen because people refuse to see things from another person's point of view. But when both sides are willing to rethink, they can find common ground. They can understand each other better. Instead of trying to win arguments, they can focus on solving problems together. This is why listening is such an important skill. Too often, people listen just to reply. They are not really trying to understand the other person. They are just waiting for their turn to speak. But real listening means being open to learning. It means being willing to change our minds if we hear something that makes sense. Rethinking is also important in education. Schools often focus on teaching students what to think instead of how to think. But the most valuable skill students can learn is how to question their own assumptions. Instead of just memorizing facts, they should learn how to evaluate evidence, how to recognize biases, and how to change their minds when new information appears. Some schools have started using a method called constructive disagreement. Instead of just debating to win, students are taught how to argue in a way that encourages learning. They practice listening to opposing views and considering different perspectives. This kind of education prepares them to be better thinkers and decision makers in the future. Even in parenting, rethinking plays a big role. Many parents feel pressure to always have the right answers for their children. But what if the best way to teach kids was to show them that learning never stops? What if parents openly admitted when they did not know something and explored the answer together with their children? This would teach kids that it is okay to be wrong, as long as they are willing to learn. At its core, rethinking is about intellectual humility. It is about knowing that no matter how much we learn, there is always more to discover. It is about recognizing that our minds should not be like stone, fixed and unchangeable. They should be like water, able to flow and adapt to new information. This does not mean we should constantly doubt everything. Some beliefs are based on strong evidence, and we do not need to change them unless new facts emerge. But it does mean staying open to the possibility that we might be wrong. It means keeping our curiosity alive. In the end, rethinking is not just about personal growth. It is about creating a better world. When more people learn to question their assumptions, society becomes more innovative, more fair, and more open to progress. Instead of being divided by rigid beliefs, we can come together through a shared commitment to learning and understanding. Every great discovery, every major breakthrough, every important change in history has happened because someone was willing to rethink. The more we embrace this mindset, the more we can achieve, both as individuals and as a society.